It seems that the previous video that I did covering smaller cruiser and destroyer actions of World War II was quite popular. So popular, in fact, that the fine folk over on Patreon voted for another instalment. And so here we are, a series of brief summaries of small ship actions that in and of themselves might not make a full Wednesday video, but are nonetheless quite interesting. So we're going to start off with a battle that came about as part of Operation Nordseetour, and yes, that literally means North Sea Tour, in late 1940. At this early stage of the war, single German cruisers were still slipping out into the North Atlantic in an effort to raid Allied shipping. The Scharnhorst-class battleships had also made the occasional foray, but up to this point the raids had primarily been the task of the Deutschland-class Panzerschiff, although the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper had made a short trip to the northern edges of the North Sea as well. During the course of 1940, the second ship in the Hipper class, the Blücher, had run afoul of the Norwegian defences of Oscarsborg and had been sunk, and the former Deutschland, now Lutzow, had been damaged. Both Scharnhorst had ended up torpedoed by the British, and of course the Graf Spee had been sunk previously. All this meant that by late summer of 1940, when more raids were ordered on Atlantic shipping, only the Deutschland-class Admiral Scheer and the Admiral Hipper-class Admiral Hipper were actually in a position to deploy, since the only other undamaged German large vessels at this point were the Bismarck and the third ship of the Hipper class, the Prinz Eugen, and neither had commissioned just yet. At this point in time, there were two possible mission profiles listed for the Hipper. It could deploy to raid shipping, or potentially it could act as bait for the entire home fleet as an attempted distraction in the event that the German invasion of the UK, Operation Sea Lion, actually went ahead. Fortunately for the Hipper and her crew, Operation XP Pinata was cancelled, with the decision to not try and invade England with a fleet of small craft, of which a distressingly large number lacked basic equipment like, engines, and so Hipper was instead ordered into the North Atlantic. This initially didn't go too well. A broken pump and an engine room fire saw her forced to retrace her steps after she first sailed in late September, and she tried again in late November under the standard German orders not to engage with enemy warships of a similar or greater force to her own. After two quick refueling stops from a tanker and some horrific weather in between, Hipper found herself near the end of the year, with her machinery playing up once again, and she'd spotted precisely 0 Allied convoys. And so she decided to sail for occupied France to try again some other time. But 4 days later, on Christmas Eve, she hit the jackpot. Although Axis vessels intercepting any convoy was a bad thing, Convoy WS5A was one of those convoys you really, really didn't want them intercepting. It was packed with supplies that were desperately needed for Malta in one part of the convoy, and in the other part of the convoy were 40,000 troops and all the supplies they needed, headed to reinforce the Allied position in Egypt, although they were going to be looping around the entirety of Africa to get there, as running through the central Mediterranean gauntlet with troop ships was just a fraction suicidal. If Hipper could disperse or destroy this convoy, it could have colossal strategic implications far beyond the immediate, admittedly very large loss of life that it would have caused. To be fair, the Royal Navy hadn't exactly skimped out on the convoy's escort. They knew that the Germans had no operational capital ships, and so they didn't see a need to assign a battleship escort at the moment, but there were 3 light cruisers. 2 of them were Dido class with their extensive anti-aircraft batteries. The other was the much older and smaller Dunedin. But this vessel carried a precious surface search radar set, which was still a relative rarity in those early days of the war. The 2 Didos at this stage did have air search radar, but this was far less effective in this surface search role. There were also 2 aircraft carriers, the relatively small Argus and the larger Furious, but since these were carrying a lot of aircraft bound for the Mediterranean theatre, they only had a limited air group to deploy, and of course they would make very choice targets for Hipper, especially Argus, since Furious at least had a chance of running away. Finally, there was the county-class heavy cruiser HMS Berwick, which had so far been unlucky in war, deploying on several occasions but seeing no action, only to finally get stuck into a fight with the Regia Mariner a few months earlier and get a turret knocked out for her troubles. However, this escort force was collectively far in excess of Hipper's own firepower, and according to her own orders, she should have turned away. But Hipper did not realise what she was facing, as the weather was so appalling that the only contact initially held with the convoy was via radar. And on radar, there was no way to tell what exactly they were looking at other than potentially the various relative sizes of ship. Since it was also night, and therefore visibility was terrible, and suspecting that the large contact at the back of the convoy was some kind of escort, possibly an armed merchantman, Hipper opened the action with a speculative torpedo salvo just as Christmas Eve turned into Christmas Day. But this had no effect. With daybreak came the first, limited, visual sightings of the convoy, including its escort. Catching sight of Berwick early on, the Germans decided to close in for a stealthy torpedo launch, and then follow it up with gunfire. The argument being that since Berwick had no idea they were there, the force balance was actually in their favour. Since the Hipper class had 4 triple torpedo launchers, she still had 3 sets available, and she approached on the side that hadn't fired torpedoes yet, so she would get 2 potential chances. The range clock ticked down, and soon they were a mere 6,000 yards away. But then someone, somewhere, either made the wrong call, or alternatively, the captain changed his mind at the last minute. It depends exactly which source you believe. But in either case, instead of launching torpedoes, the main battery opened up on Berwick. The blast of their firing meant that it was almost impossible for the aft torpedo launchers to be deployed, and the blast appears to have disabled the motors that allowed the mount to be trained out in any case. And moments later, the secondary battery, which concluded that, well, it was clearly time to shoot at something, opened up at basically any target they could see, which turned out to mostly be the nearest transport ships. Their blast meant that using the forward torpedo launcher was also out of the question. However, since it was obvious to anyone with more than 2 functioning brain cells that dawn was a prime time to attack, whatever the weather, Berwick had preemptively gone to action stations some time earlier, and so when gun flashes and fountains of water from Shell's landing gave them some fairly obvious pointers that, yes, they were in fact under attack, the ship responded rapidly, returning fire less than 2 minutes after Hipper's opening salvo. This precluded the German ship ceasing fire to deploy its torpedoes, and now it would be a close-range slugging match. But all the escorts were now on alert. One of the Didos had left the convoy less than 12 hours earlier, but Dunedin and Bonaventure were sighted closing in on Hipper's position shortly after the battle began. Now outnumbered and outgunned, although not knowing exactly what the other approaching ships were as they were only spotted as radar contacts, and conscious that the British ships might launch their own torpedoes at any moment, Hipper began to withdraw, having thus far only scored a handful of hits on 2 of the transports. Berwick had also deployed a smoke screen to shield the convoy, behind which the nearest cruiser, Bonaventure, was rapidly approaching. Hipper briefly took a few shots at her since the radar was of course unaffected by smoke, although they thought she was a destroyer. Quite how bad the weather was can be seen in that, despite the 2 heavy cruisers being at point-blank range and both having a fairly good fire control and director system, neither side scored a single hit on the other at this stage, despite at this range you'd expect the 2 of them to have shot each other to pieces at this point. A few minutes later, though, after a successful disengagement, both ships would spot each other again. Hipper had managed to open the range by about 2,000 yards to 8,000, and both sides promptly opened fire once more. But for another 15 minutes, as their hulls swayed, pitched, and rolled in the heavy seas, and sailors manning the rangefinders struggled to see anything in the low light and the rain, 8-inch shells pounded the ocean, but not much else. Hipper's crew had basically given up on visually spotting the shell splashes and were instead peering at their radar screen, hoping that might tell them something. while aboard Berwick, which lacked a surface search radar, the crew were reduced to waiting for the muzzle flare of the enemy ship firing and then trying to aim on that. Eventually, though, statistics had to catch up, and as we've already established, poor old Berwick was the punching bag of bad luck for the County class, and so she began taking hits as the second engagement approached the 20-minute mark. At first, though, it seemed she might have something of fortune with her, as the first hit smashed into the aft superfiring turret, which was empty as it had yet to be repaired after being disabled by the Italians earlier in the year, and the shell further turned out to be a dud. But the second shell either fell slightly short and plunged through a short section of ocean, or else perhaps Berwick had been broaching a wave, but in either case it managed to hit the ship below the waterline and understandably caused a degree of flooding. A third hit damaged one of the 4-inch anti-aircraft gun mountings, bouncing off it to explode in the superstructure, and the last hit came in on the belt armour, which actually did its job and rejected the shell, although the explosion of the shell nearby in the sea did cause some minor flooding in the ship's rather minimal torpedo defence systems. But with multiple unknown enemy warships approaching, and of course not knowing what damage they'd managed to do, if they even hit anything, Hipper elected to withdraw into the cover of the weather, leaving the British escort to set about reassembling the convoy, which had begun to scatter. Berwick would need extensive dry dock time to be patched up, while Hipper would evade air searches and manage to reach Brest. Although having been the only one to do any damage in the engagement, this voyage actually ended up doing considerably more damage to German prospects than it did to Allied, as it prompted the British to increase the strength of convoy escorts generally, the result of which was that when the Scharnhorst returned for Operation Berlin in the Atlantic, they were forced to break off a number of attacks due to the presence of escorting battleships, plus one rather hair-raising encounter where Gneisenau was almost run down by HMS Rodney. For our next encounter, we're staying in 1940 but moving a little bit eastwards into the Mediterranean for the Battle of the Espero convoy. Neither side actually set out to fight the other in what would turn out to be the first major encounter of Italian and Allied warships during World War II. What happened was that, having thrown their lot in with the Germans, the Italians realised there were an uncomfortable number of tanks in British-held Egypt and a worryingly small number of anti-tank capable weapons in Italian-held Libya. Due to the need to get some reinforcements in place ASAP, and the fact that anti-tank units are, relatively speaking, manpower light compared to infantry, and at this stage of the war their weapons weren't massively bulky or heavy, it was decided to stick a bunch of them on some destroyers who would then make a high-speed dash for North Africa, along with a bunch of other emergency sailings which included another destroyer unit loaded with anti-tank units, a small convoy with general supplies, and several submarines, all of which were heading for different ports. In this case, we're looking at the destroyer convoy where the relevant ships were the destroyers Espero, Zefiro, and Ostro. To the east, a large portion of the Mediterranean fleet was dispersed in various groups escorting or providing cover for various convoys, or else repositioning to better counter the new enemy to their west. Part of this included the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla, which was hunting for enemy submarines, supported by reconnaissance aircraft operating further ahead of them in order to spot potential contacts, as well as the 7th Cruiser Squadron, which was operating slightly behind to back them up in case anything bigger than a submarine happened to be out there. On the night of the 27th of June 1940, they spotted, pursued, depth-charged, and eventually would force the surrender of an Italian submarine, which subsequently sank after the crew were rescued. Just after noon the next day, a Sunderland flying boat on distant patrol, but vaguely attached to this hunting group, spotted a trio of Italian destroyers on a run southeast heading from Taranto to Tobruk. This information was passed on to Admiral Tovey, who was at this stage in charge of the cruisers, and he decided to head over and try for an intercept. He had 5 cruisers with him, the Leander-class Orion, Neptune and Sydney, and the Town-class Liverpool and Gloucester. He put the ships into lines by class with the intention of catching the Italian ships between them, The British cruisers headed southwest, with the Leanders on the starboard side and the Towns on the port side. At about 1830, lookouts aboard Liverpool, which was leading its column and the formation as a whole, spotted the destroyers coming in from starboard and shortly thereafter opened fire. The Italian ships realised they were massively outgunned and so turned 90 degrees to starboard, matching the cruiser's southwest course, but somewhat ahead of them, hoping to outrun them. It wasn't going to be as easy as it sounded, though. On paper, the Italian ships had been recorded as reaching 36 knots on trials, which would give them a 3 to 4 knot speed advantage. But in practice, their normal speed was a bit closer to 33 to 34 knots, barely a single knot speed advantage. And not only were they loaded down with additional men and equipment, but the sea state was also quite heavy, which favoured larger ships with more mass. And so despite their best efforts, the British cruisers were gradually closing in, although the Italian ships were hoping that the setting sun might dazzle the British rangefinders, buying time enough for them to slip away into the gathering darkness. At this stage, you might be wondering why the Italian ships weren't using their torpedoes. Between them, they had 18 such weapons, and even forcing the British ships to break off to evade for a while would likely have bought them the time that they needed. In this case, the answer was fairly simple. The very same troops and supplies that were slowing them down, so that they were in this predicament in the first place, also happened to be in the way of the torpedo launchers on deck. Still, they decided they were going to make smoke, and between that and the dazzle effect of the sun, it made them very difficult targets. Range ticked down from an opening volley at 18,000 yards, and the Italian destroyers also returned fire as best they could. 6 minutes into the action, and Neptune reported that she thought there were torpedoes in the water, although it's not clear if there actually were, but in any case the British vessels did take some evasive action, and so 20 minutes after the shooting started, they'd only managed to close the range down by about 4,000 yards. But shortly after this point, a shell found Espero, and she began to lose speed. The British bypassed her to pursue the other two, and kept up this pursuit for a little bit longer. But with night closing in, the gunnery conditions were getting almost impossible. Again, in a period of the war where surface search radar with enough accuracy to be used to help with gunnery was relatively rare. And so, after a further 10 to 15 minutes, the last two Italian ships were allowed to slip away. The British formation then headed for Malta, with the exception of HMAS Sydney, which was dispatched to finish off the now stopped Espero. The Italian ship defiantly opened up on the cruiser as she approached, and Sydney responded, so soon, rather unsurprisingly, Espero was on fire and sinking. With the threat gone, Sydney closed in to pick up survivors, but this effort was made much more difficult by the fact that Sydney was not allowed to use any lights. After all, they'd been escorting an anti-submarine sweep nearby, and any Italian submarine for miles around would have seen the pillar of flame that had marked Espero's passing. After nearly 2 hours, 47 survivors had been rescued, but Sydney couldn't afford to wait around any longer. And so one of the ship's boats was loaded with supplies and water, and a large signal flare was set aboard and lit up so that anyone else in the water would have a fighting chance of seeing it and boarding it. Then the cruiser left. Although this was an on-paper victory for the British, with their only damage being an utterly ruined evening meal aboard Sydney, as its crew had been about to tuck in when action stations sounded, and the subsequent concussion of gunfire across the ship's bow had sent all the crockery and the food that was on it to the floor, the encounter actually caused a lot more problems than it solved. Due to the extremely poor gunnery conditions and the understandable reluctance of the Italian destroyers to simply sail in a straight line and be hit, around 5,000 6-inch shells had been expended, vastly exceeding the number that were actually available for resupply in Alexandria. Since the entire squadron was now dangerously low on ammunition, they were forced to head back for what restocking was available, and in their absence, a number of Allied convoys were delayed, and that, in turn, would lead to the Battle of Calabria a couple of weeks later. We're now going to stay in the Mediterranean, but move forward in time almost a year to the Battle of the Tarigo convoy, another confrontation between the British and the Italians, this time in April 1941. Once again, it was an Axis convoy that provoked the encounter. At this stage of the war, Axis shipping was now heading southwest instead of southeast, as the port of call was now Tripoli. Meanwhile, Admiral Cunningham was being pressured to do something about the convoys, as the flow of German and Italian reinforcements was causing some issues in the land campaign. Having fended off yet another one of Churchill's ideas that involved sailing in a sacrificial battleship or two — he seemed to have quite a few of those — Cunningham instead took 4 of his larger destroyers, the J-class HMS Jervis and HMS Janus, and the Tribal-class HMS Nubian and HMS Mohawk, and based them at Malta, with the intention of them sailing fast under the cover of darkness to intercept convoys that might be heading past to the west. Their first sorties were failures, Italian intelligence detecting the aircraft reconnaissance efforts that were needed to tell them where to go, and diverting the affected convoys. But a day or so later, the shoe was on the other foot. A convoy of 4 troop transports and an ammunition ship escorted by 1 large and 2 small destroyers was heading south, and now it was the British who had the intelligence advantage, having intercepted and triangulated various radio messages, and then confirmed the convoy's course and composition with a reconnaissance aircraft. The British destroyers set sail as soon as possible, but the convoy had spotted the recon aircraft and asked the Regia Aeronautica for help. Unfortunately for them, in this rare instance of the Regia Aeronautica actually being willing to help the Regia Marina in a timely fashion, bad weather had grounded most of the aircraft that were assigned to the mission, and the very few that got airborne failed to find anything. At this stage, they were actually anticipating a large-scale air attack from torpedo bombers based at Malta, as they didn't have any intelligence on the British destroyers being available. Meanwhile, the British ships were having great fun trying to actually find the convoy. They arrived at the expected interception point about 9 hours after the reconnaissance aircraft sighting and found nothing. It was now just before 2 o'clock in the morning, and they began to go through a list of alternate locations. Pretty much where the convoy might be if it turned out it was actually moving slower than expected, or if it had changed course, for example. But as the clocks ticked forward to almost exactly 0200, the convoy was sighted about 6 nautical miles to the south, and the British ships began moving to place the convoy between them and the moon. The idea was to silhouette the enemy ships against the moonlight while themselves remaining hidden in darkness. 3 of the 4 British ships now had surface search radar fine enough for gunnery control, whereas it was thought, correctly, that the Italians did not have this equipment. But even with radar, the light advantage meant that the nature of each enemy ship could be more easily ascertained, and the most dangerous ones engaged first. The British ships then began closing the range down as much as possible, following pre-war doctrine in night actions of training your guns on the enemy and then creeping ever closer until you saw them twitch, then you opened fire. In this case, they managed to open fire at just 2,400 yards, a range at which even the 40mm pom-pom anti-aircraft guns managed to come into play, and the opening salvos savaged the destroyer Baleno, wiping out its command crew and setting it on fire. With the ship sinking fast, the survivors had no choice but to head for the nearest shallow water to try and go aground. With a hole in the escort screen, the transports would now come under fire, with 3 of the 5 ships hit quite rapidly, including a fire which was started aboard the ammunition ship. But these proceedings were interrupted when the large Italian destroyer Tarigo appeared, having doubled back to defend its charges. She came under intense point-blank fire from the Nubian, then the Jervis, and then the Mohawk, and as Tarigo's battered shell zipped past heading in the other direction, on fire and rapidly slowing, attention was returned to the merchantman. The ammunition ship somewhat predictably chose this point in proceedings to explode as fires reached something unstable, showering everybody with flaming debris. The British destroyers now decided to enter among the convoy and begin laying waste to it, when suddenly a torpedo blew off Mohawk's stern. In keeping with the tradition of tribal-class destroyers whose captains and crews were sourced from only the finest free-range asylums in the Empire, Mohawk took the loss of a major portion of its structure as merely a mild inconvenience and commenced fire on the merchant ships once it was evident they weren't in immediate danger of sinking. However, shortly thereafter, another torpedo hit Mohawk, this one amidships, and she began to rapidly settle. It turned out that while she was mostly crippled, at least one of Tarigo's torpedo launchers was still working, and somebody aboard had been taking advantage of the fact the British were essentially ignoring her to fire off the remaining torpedoes one at a time, at close range, at whatever they could see. Janus and Jervis then determined they had to finish off the Tarigo, with the latter narrowly being missed by the Italian destroyer's last operational torpedo. The valiant Tarigo then exploded and rolled over and sank under a hail of 4.7-inch shells. Meanwhile, having cleared the other side of the convoy, Nubian found the last remaining Italian destroyer, the Lampo, and quickly put her in a sinking condition with rapid-fire salvos. Then it was just about clean-up duty. Having satisfied themselves that all the ships in the convoy were either sunk, sinking, aground, or liberally distributed over several square miles of sea, the remaining British ships began picking up Italian survivors from the sea and the crew of Mohawk from their slowly sinking ship. Apart from the 42 men killed by the direct torpedo hits, the rest of Mohawk's crew were successfully rescued. Janus then finished off the tribal class, which had settled in a partially afloat condition at that point, and the destroyers then headed back for Malta. In exchange for the loss of Mohawk, the Axis forces had lost 3 destroyers, 300 vehicles, 3,500 tons of supplies, and around 1,700 men between those on the destroyed transports and the crews of the destroyers. Around 1,200 further troops would be rescued in the following days by Italian ships, either picking the survivors out of the water or from the hulk of a transport, or possibly 2, depending on sources, which had gone aground in the shallows. Much later, the destroyer Lampo, which had also run aground, was salvaged and put back into service, although she would be sunk again, this time permanently, a couple of years later while on another convoy run. The last engagement we'll look at today would take place just over 2 years later and half a planet away. In October 1943, the Solomon Islands campaign, which was the follow-on to the Guadalcanal campaign, was wrapping up the Central Solomons stage of proceedings. Back at the end of the previous campaign, the Japanese had enacted Operation Ki, a mostly successful effort to evacuate their remaining troops. Now they sought to repeat this effort. A rather interesting variety of small craft was sent to grab the last remaining troops with a mixed covering force. 3 older small destroyers, the Fumizuki, Matsukaze, and Yonagi, were there ostensibly to provide cover but also to act as backup transports if needed. They were second-line combat ships at this stage in time, and they'd done many transport runs already. With them were 6 larger and much more modern destroyers, the Akigumo, Isokaze, Kazagumo, Yugamo, Shigure, and Samidare, which were there purely in a combat role to cover everybody else. Learning of the presence of the Japanese forces, Admiral Wilkinson was forced to scramble a last-minute response. His only readily available force was 3 destroyers strong, not enough to take on 9 Japanese destroyers of unknown individual capacity. And so he ordered 3 more destroyers off of convoy escort duty to join them, with both groups heading for a planned rendezvous point near where it was thought the Imperial Japanese Navy forces would arrive. The lead group was the Porter-class USS Selfridge, an interwar destroyer leader with 8 5-inch guns, and 2 Fletcher-class, the Chevalier and the O'Bannon, with 2 additional Fletchers, the LaVellette and Taylor, plus the Bagley-class USS Rolfe Talbot, making up the second group. The lead US group did have some advantages. All 3 ships had the latest SG surface search radar and prototype combat information centers. Indeed, the entire engagement would be led from Selfridge's CIC rather than from the bridge. The Japanese forces had split themselves into 3 sections. The Shigure and Samidare were escorting the 3 smaller destroyers. The other 4 big destroyers were slightly further back, and the transport flotilla was further back still. Unfortunately for the US ships, a Japanese float plane managed to find them, and it kept dropping flares on them while reporting their position. Alerted to enemy vessels nearby, the Japanese admiral, Ijuin, I think, ordered the smaller destroyers to withdraw and their escorts to rejoin the main force. With the Imperial Japanese Navy reaching the planned US rendezvous point early, Captain Walker, aboard Selfridge, had to decide whether to engage with just his 3 ships. At this point, both sides thought they were up against a much larger force. Walker thought he faced 9 frontline destroyers with his 3, while Ijuin, misled by the floatplane pilot, thought that he faced 3 destroyers and 4 cruisers. Both sides, however, determined they were going to fight anyway. But with both sides expecting something very different, a series of errors would rapidly begin to cascade. Thinking that the US ships, especially the unusual profile of Selfridge, were cruisers, Ijuin thought the formation was considerably further away than it actually was once it was spotted visually, and he began to move his ships to cross the T of the US formation. But of course, they moved too slowly. With the supposed cruisers suddenly seeming to cross the distance far more rapidly than they should be able to, the Yugamo tried to buy time for the other ships by charging the US formation headlong. Brave as it was, it also meant Yugamo was in the way of the other Japanese Navy ships' torpedo salvos, and so they had to hold their fire. Dying for the Emperor was all well and good, but it was generally held that this should be at the hands of the enemy, not that you should be blown up by your friends just because you happened to be in the way. Someone should have told Megami that. On the other hand, she was an excellent distraction. The US destroyers let fly with their guns and no less than half of their incomplete torpedo complement on the one ship, bearing in mind that they thought at this point there were another 8 enemy vessels out there somewhere. Albeit at the close range Yugamo was reaching, she could potentially have put paid to the entire US formation with selected volleys from her payload of long lances, so perhaps the overkill was understandable. And indeed, upon seeing the muzzle flashes, the Japanese destroyer did volley fire her 8 loaded torpedoes before taking repeated hits from 5-inch shells, which crippled her steering. But minutes later, the long lances arrived, and they erased the entirety of Chevalier's bow all the way back to the bridge. What was left of the ship slewed out of line. She'd been behind Selfridge but ahead of O'Bannon. The latter couldn't see what was going through the mixture of gun smoke and the explosion on Chevalier's bow, and so the first thing they knew of what had happened was when O'Bannon smashed into what was left of Chevalier as the aft section of the latter destroyer appeared out of the pool of smoke. Locked together, both ships were well and truly out of the battle. Moments later, Yugamo spotted one of the Mark 15 torpedoes from the US destroyers in the water, but, with her steering out, was unable to do all that much but watch as the weapon toodled up to the side of the ship and, as luck would have it, actually decided to explode. Yugamo slipped beneath the waves 7 minutes later. Selfridge decided, well, it was too late to quit now, and pressed on against what she believed were now 8-1 odds against her. But only 7 minutes after Chevalier was forcibly foreshortened and barely 3 minutes after Yugamo was hit, another long lance, this one from either Shigure or Samidare, blew a chunk off her bow as well. All 3 ships in the US formation were now dead in the water, and there were 5 intact Imperial Japanese Navy destroyers right there. By all rights, Ijuin should now have consigned all 3 of his opponents to the deep. But another helpful float plane reported the approach of another group of US ships, the beleaguered reinforcement trio. And just like the other pilot, this one also reckoned that the incoming vessels were in fact cruisers. Building on the first report, which indicated there might be another cruiser and 3 destroyers in the immediate area, plus these new ships, Ijuin decided it was time to go. He salvoed off his remaining ready-use long lances, which all missed, and departed. Both sides initially claimed to have been the winner of what was christened the Battle of Vella LaVella. By the time the Imperial Japanese Navy forces got home, they'd decided that they'd sunk 5 enemy ships, 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers, while the US formation believed that they in turn had sent 3 enemy destroyers to the bottom. In actual fact, the Japanese had only lost the Yugamo, and as it turned out, the US side had only lost Chevalier, as it became clear that there was no saving the remaining fragment of the destroyer, and after taking her crew off, the LaVella, which at this stage had arrived with the other two latecomers, put the two halves of the ship on the bottom as the bow was floating off nearby. The bowless Selfridge restarted her engines and backed gingerly out of the area, while the somewhat bent-nosed O'Bannon managed to extract itself facing the right way around. As well as scoring the most damage, with one enemy ship sunk and one badly damaged and another somewhat damaged, although the latter was by its own doing, in exchange for one of their own lost, the Imperial Japanese Navy's troop transports managed to use the confusion to successfully evacuate the approximately 600 troops who were waiting for them. However, this was to be the last significant Japanese surface victory in World War II, and as Churchill had famously said in the aftermath of Dunkirk, wars are not won by evacuations. There was also the rather large elephant in the room. After the 7th of October 1943, the date of the battle, the Japanese would commission 13 further frontline fleet destroyers between then and the end of the war. The US would match that feat in 6 weeks and a day after the battle ended, as that would be when the USS Mertz and USS McDermott commissioned on the 19th of November 1943, which rather puts the whole thing into some perspective.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.